Welcome to Just Thinking. This is Mary Greendale. The title of this show grew out of a lifetime of curiosity about many different subjects. Some local, some global, and some in between. For each show, I will open with my thoughts and then bring on guests to explore the subject in greater detail. I hope the show inspires healthy discussions on camera and among viewers. To me, the sky's the limit when we are just thinking. Hi, I'm Mary Greendale, and welcome to Just Thinking. I decided to do today's show after reading a gripping story written by Dr. Sherry Fink in the August 30th, 2018 New York Times Magazine. She wrote about the disaster response during Hurricane Harvey. Fink is a Pulitzer Prize-winning correspondent for the New York Times. The story was as riveting as any bestseller and ended with a tragic and unnecessary death. Dr. Fink reported that, and I quote, Houston thought it was prepared for a major hurricane like Harvey. But as the flooding overwhelmed the city's emergency systems, families found out too late that they were on their own. Now, as I understand it, here in Massachusetts, in a regional or statewide disaster, each community is expected to sort of take care of its own emergencies for the first 72 hours, like a major snowstorm. And we're not supposed to rely or count on the state or federal services being able to arrive in that time. There were a few specific topics in Dr. Fink's article that made me wonder about Holliston and Massachusetts preparedness, especially in light of the dramatic changes and the magnitude and frequency of weather disasters. There are clearly two different kinds of disasters: localized, just happening here, and regional. And equipment and personnel would be dispatched very differently, I assume. And weather disasters, which I assume are most likely what we would see, typically cover wide swaths of an area or even the entire state or New England. Each produces different challenges. Many of the concerns come down to communication. I'd like to focus on communication today and look at disasters through the eyes of the average person in Holliston. What do we need, want for services, and what can we do to prepare and protect ourselves? My guests today are Mikael Cassidy, Holliston's Fire Chief and Emergency Management Director, and Michael Main, the Regional Manager for the Emergency Management Agency, MEMA. It's much easier for Region 1. Hi guys, thanks so much for coming. I really do appreciate it, and welcome to Holliston. Have you been here before?
I have been here before.
Oh, okay, all right, so then we don't have to do all of that. Okay, so have you had a chance to look at that article? Did you see it ever before or whatever? I mean, I thought it was a great, just well-written story.
I saw it after you sent me the link.
Yeah, it was quite something. So the big thing that kind of did all kinds of bells and everything for me was the 911 system, so I'd kind of like to dive in there. It appears that there are two different ways in which 911 could be done, analog or digital. And most of us are on analog. Is Massachusetts?
So Massachusetts has been moving towards what's referred to as a next generation 911 system. And Massachusetts is actually leading the nation in terms of complying with the FCC regulations and the deadlines that have been imposed.
All right, and what does that mean? I mean, what does the next generation?
So for years, we've been explaining to people that if you call from a landline, the phone is going to go to the local public safety answering point, which is the Holliston Police Department. If it's a fire or ambulance emergency, they'll transfer the call to our secondary public safety answering point, which is the fire department, at which point resources will be dispatched.
That's from a landline?
That's from a landline. Now, for years, we've been telling folks that if you call from a wireless, from a cell phone in this region, then it would be routed through the state police in Framingham first. With next generation 911, through the use of GIS technology and mapping, they're now able to direct that wireless caller directly to the community in which they are calling from. So now, if you call 911 from in front of Fisk's, instead of it going to State Police Framingham and finding out enough information so that they can then transfer it to Holliston, the call is now being routed directly to the Holliston Police Department for answering, which saves those seconds, which are very important. So
in Houston or in Massachusetts, until all of these changes took place, all of those calls would, for this region would have been going into Framingham?
Correct.
Everything, so 50 people from Holliston call and everything is going into Framingham. It's easy to understand how, if you would, switchboards get overloaded. That's a lot of calls. So is this all in place? So Holliston right now is done.
Holliston has completed the conversion to next-gen 911.
Congratulations to us. How did we do that? We get a grant or something and you did something?
The state 911 department determined which communities were going to roll out first, and we were in the early phase.
Thank you. All right. So it just happened that way.
All of those little charges that appear on your phone bill that go to support the statewide 911 department have made all of these infrastructure improvements possible.
Really? Is that? Oh, that's good to know. I think that's important information. So now, Michael, I know that you've been working up in the Andover-Lawrence area and the aftermath of the explosions up there. Do they have the digital, the next generation system up there?
I don't know the answer to that question. I know everyone's working towards that next-gen system. That's kind of the big push
Goal.
now for all communities is working towards that next-gen system, just as the chief was describing, to be able to pinpoint those calls directly to those communities.
So what happened with calls up there? Were you buried? I mean, they buried whoever. Who is they? Who would they be? Where do they go?
So it depends on the community. Some communities are serviced by a regional call-taking center.
Okay.
And others have individual emergency dispatcher locations, as we do here in Holliston.
Like us. Okay.
We've got a primary, that's the police department, and we have a secondary, which is the fire department. Some communities have one that covers both departments, and then some communities are part of a regional response where you call and they may be dispatching resources for 6 or 8 or 10 different communities.
Right, and I believe in Lawrence, I think the police department is their primary 911 call. And I know in that disaster situation, a lot of their calls were being pushed to other local communities as their 911 system was getting overwhelmed. So it was going into Andover and North Andover and Tewksbury and some of those other surrounding communities that were answering some of those 911 calls.
So are the calls just sort of automatically forwarded? Does somebody, like at home, if I can forward my landline to call my cell phone with whatever call comes in.
And
okay. So does that happen automatically like there?
That's all coordinated through the state 911 department and the programming. And so right now, if there's a surge of 911 calls that occur in Holliston, it will bump to Ashland.
Okay.
And the caller is blind to the fact that that call has been transferred.
Okay.
Because when the call is answered, it's 911, what is your emergency? They don't say Holliston Police.
Right.
So if a call taker in Ashland takes a call for an emergency in Holliston, they'll get the information, they'll confirm the address, they'll confirm what the problem is, and they'll say, we'll get help on the way. And then they will relay that information to Holliston, but behind the scenes, the caller has no idea that they were speaking to a call taker in Ashland.
But I'm thinking of all kinds of ways in which that must be a little unnerving to the person who's on the phone. Maybe they're used to hearing a certain voice that's the dispatcher, or this person who answered the phone didn't recognize my voice. What do you mean? Everybody knows my voice. That kind of thing. There has to be a certain unsettling feeling to it. So
for a small town like Holliston, absolutely.
Yeah,
for larger communities, of course, when we start giving references like I'm on Phipps Hill, I just had a crash, that sort of reference would mean nothing for a dispatcher from Ashland. However, with the next gen technology, the mapping software in front of them, it shows them what range on Washington Street that the crash has occurred.
Yep.
And so they're able to confirm the details of, okay, I see you're on Washington Street between Mark Tree and Highland Street. And so it calms and reassures, and they may just think, oh, it's a new dispatcher, one I haven't met before.
Right. Okay, so this next gen will solve that sort of anxiety behind the scenes kind of problem. The other thing that could happen, I suppose, is you can talk about the fact that there's this automatic forwarding system. So in the case of the Merrimack Valley, where calls were being forwarded, were there problems with the 911? I mean, did you just get overwhelmed and...
Yeah, I think it was just taking some of the pressure off of that Lawrence 911 system. It was, as it was rolling over to those other communities, it helped alleviate some of that backup of calls that were coming in, as the other communities could help handle them. And if they weren't, it just kept forwarding on that system.
How do they know that they're going to be getting these calls? I mean, I don't mean, yes, there's a plan, okay, but does somebody contact them and say, we've had an explosion over here and you might expect to get these calls, or does it all just happens so fast that nobody can stop to do that.
From a situational awareness standpoint, most communities are monitoring nearby towns. And
Okay.
so as soon as the first resources were dispatched to a report of a house explosion, the communities around Lawrence would have been aware of the fact that something was taking place.
Okay.
And so when they start getting additional calls for odor of gas, reports of fires, it wouldn't really catch them off guard, because part of their job is not only monitoring the radios and the phones in their community, but monitoring what's going on in the contiguous communities, because when something happens, that dispatcher needs to know right away whether or not calling Andover or North Andover is going to be an option for mutual aid. We do the same thing now. As you know, I started as a dispatcher years ago, and so we monitor Ashland, Sherburne,
Sure.
Medway, Millis, Milford, Hopkinton, and therefore when we have an issue and we need assistance, the dispatcher, if they've been paying attention to what's been going on when it was quiet and nothing was going on in our town, they already know, oh, Ashland's not an option right now because they're at a call at the residence at Valley Farm. Milford's not an option because they're at a call out on 495. So you already know roughly who's available in the region around you.
Okay. So what's the training for this kind of, for using 911 for among the folks, you people? Okay. Do you have, do you somehow go through how this all works for people, or is it just everybody assumes that they know how it all works, or is it just?
So telecommunicators receive basic training. Many of them get that training from the state 911 department. So they understand not only how to use the physical equipment that is provided by the state, but they also understand the overview of how calls work at a global level. And then when they come back to the community in which they're working, that's the responsibility of the dispatch supervisor to orient them, to let them know our surge calls go to Ashland, just so that they have an understanding of, if you're in the middle of something and you get a call from Ashland on the radio, you'll know why. It's because they're getting the overflow calls.
What happens if you're right on a boundary? Like, these towns are close to New Hampshire, we're close to Rhode Island. What happens with them? I mean, are they ever the fallback or the place that things are forwarded to?
Any idea?
I mean, I think they could. So I know in terms of the mutual aid, as the chief was talking about, they certainly have those mutual aid agreements with those bordering communities. So, you know, for the Merrimack Valley, there were New Hampshire companies that came in. There were New Hampshire fire departments that came in. So I think they have those. In terms of the actual role of the call, I'm not sure if that's one of the options.
That's an interesting question.
It probably is, but I can't give you a definite answer on that one.
Okay, all right. I don't know. It just occurred to me that because we're both so close. So, Michael, why don't you tell me when a situation arises, as it did in the gas explosions, what happens in your life?
So our agency is really a support agency to the community. So when something like this happens, you know, we go in, usually not as first responders, not fire departments, police departments, but we're usually there within a few hours of that incident happening. We provide a lot of resource coordination, so other state agencies that could potentially provide resources to whatever the incident is.
Trucks, equipment.
Yep, trucks, equipment, light towers, a lot of the support for those types of facilities, you know, things that you kind of don't think of right as you're trying to deal with an emergency, but that you're going to need all those support services for. We can help bring in some of that, or tie in whatever those local communities need with whatever state agencies we potentially could bring in. You know, things like Department of Fire Services, the state police, some of those other state agencies that we can help coordinate that communication with. You know, we help do some of that work, as well as providing information. So we take whatever information we can gather at that scene in order to push it out to all the local communities, the Gov's office, you know, some of those different places that are going to need that information on a pretty timely basis.
Within your operation, do you have communications people that are specifically for the communications piece?
We do.
You do?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a small communications department that I think there's 4 of them at headquarters that do radio communications. They do our, you know, any sort of our radio work, patching different channels together so that everyone can kind of speak on the same level of those emergencies.
So you all do some sort of planning. There's always a plan. So tell me about the planning, because as I listen to you describe this, I'm picturing, I don't know, we'll say any town, because it's not just Lawrence and it's not just Andover, but any town, you've got the police department that's used to doing its thing its way, and even if everybody in Lawrence does everything exactly the way it's supposed to be, maybe the people from Andover do it slightly differently, or is that not the case? So let's use Holliston instead of those other towns, because we don't know.
Absolutely. So Holliston has a plan. Holliston has a comprehensive emergency management plan, which has been in place for decades. It gets tweaked along the way on an annual basis. I review the plan. I submit a copy of the plan to MEMA. They've got a copy of it so that if something happens to me, the plan is on file with someone else.
Let me ask you a question about that plan. Is that the place in which, and I remember doing this for Red Cross, the exit points and stuff for the nursing home, we had to submit something that described the nursing home over on Elm Street and how people would get them out, those patients. Is that kind of thing in the plan?
So that can be an annex to a local plan. There are, within the plan, it identifies special populations.
Okay, that's the word.
And those are groups or individuals or locations where additional assistance or resources might be required.
Okay.
The expectation is your average citizen, if we give the evacuation order, is going to be able to get in their car and head to whatever direction we tell them to go in. But we recognize that there are some specialized populations, like at a skilled rehab and nursing facility, that we're going to have a transportation deficit.
Yep.
And so the plan identifies those locations and then talks about where are we going to make up that transportation deficit from. And so
Okay.
we need to know who in the region can we contact to try and get buses or additional private ambulances, depending on the level of mobility and the specialized needs. We also have 6 group homes in town. So
True.
those individuals who are working there as overnight staff, you may have a 2 to 6 ratio of staff
to the patient,
clients,
client, yeah.
but that person who's showing up in their smart car isn't going to be able to put somebody who's on a ventilator in the back seat of their own car and move them to another community where there's a shelter that's been set up. So those are specialized populations that have been identified that might need assistance.
And the time of year has to make an immense difference. I mean, everything is slowed down if you've got to worry about cold, whether it's for the oxygen tanks or whether it's for coats or no matter what.
And during the summer, you have the reverse problem. Sometimes
Yeah.
people just don't tolerate heat well.
Yeah, yeah. Remember, I don't, will you?
So we have a local plan, and then beyond that local plan, there are both regional plans, and we're part of an emergency planning committee,
Yep.
which includes Ashland, Holliston, Hopkinton, Framingham, Natick, and Sherburne. So those 6 communities get together on a quarterly basis, and they plan for emergencies together, and they exercise together. And then beyond that, there are statewide plans. And these are the plans that were used for the Merrimack Valley situation. And there's a statewide plan for moving fire assets across the state. There are statewide plans for moving ambulances across the state. And as we saw in the wake of the Springfield tornado several years ago, there are plans for moving disaster assets across the state. And there are plans for moving forestry resources across the state. A couple of years ago, we went to Framingham. They had a 3-day fire in the Knobscot Boy Scout Reservation, and we were mobilized as part of a fire mobilization task force where we joined up with other forestry resources from the state to take care of that brush fire.
So how do you do these plans? In person? Are your things done? Do you ever practice for real?
Sure. Yep. So our plans are developed typically in concert with a number of partners. It's a number of state agencies, a number of nonprofits, things like the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, some of those types of nonprofits. Local communities a lot of times are involved. And just building out, so we, similarly to what the chief said, we also have a state comprehensive emergency management plan. But as you can imagine, it's statewide, it's not localized to a community, so it's a lot more broad in a sense in terms of the disasters and hazards that we face here in Massachusetts, what our most common ones are, what our response would look like. It sets up what we call an emergency support function structure. So we have 16, almost 17 emergency support functions that are groups of agencies that do similar missions. So things like Department of Transportation and the Department of Conservation and Recreation, working on highways, roads, those kinds of infrastructure type of issues. One of ours is the National Guard. They're one of our ESFs. So if we get to the point where we need to bring them in, we have a whole structure for them to come in and how they fit into our plan. So that plan gets updated yearly, just like the community plans do. It actually gets submitted to FEMA for their review also. And then any updates that they have, we can go back to that plan and kind of revamp and rechange it to adapt to the current situation that we're in. So it's a huge plan. It's open to the public. It's online. You can look it up on our website if you were interested in reading it or seeing what it looked like. But as the chief also mentioned, excuse me, that fire mobilization plan that he talked about and the EMS mobilization plan actually gets activated through our dispatch center at MEMA. It's a 24/7 dispatch center. But even for that Merrimack Valley, we had a number of task forces come in, fire assets especially come in to help support that response in Merrimack. And that was all coordinated through our dispatch center at MEMA.
It's mind-boggling to me. So what are our most likely disasters? Are they weather? Are they fire? Are they... Come on, guys.
Winter storms.
Winter. Okay.
So actually, you know what our number one disaster is? It's actually flooding. So you would think it might be winter storms and snowstorms, but it's actually our number one emergency that we've had in this state is actually flooding in terms of numbers.
How perfect. And I meant to bring or to send to the studio, and I completely forgot about it, the photographs from 2005 when East Holliston was underwater.
10 streets were impassable in October of 2005.
Right, and I was out there at that time as Holliston Net News and taking pictures. I've got some great pictures of the water going right across Washington Street up at my knees, and then down the side.
We had one of our fire engines was pumping water, 1,500 gallons of water per minute, trying to lower the water level.
I have a picture of it.
Near Dunkin' Donuts, and
Yep.
we were not making
dent in it.
any headway at all.
No, Houghton's Pond was run loose.
And the hydraulic force lifted the tight tank up from behind Dunkin' Donuts.
Dunkin' Donuts,
That's
yep.
the hydraulic pressure.
And that's a lot of times it's actually the groundwater flooding. It's not coastal flooding as much. It's usually the groundwater flooding when we get through rainstorms or rivers cresting, and that groundwater flooding. Just a lot of communities experience the same types of issues that you guys have here.
Okay, so let's use flooding, because that just so happened to be what the whole article was about, obviously, because it wasn't the storm itself, it was the flooding that happened. So one of the issues that they had was trying to get the right equipment and enough of the right equipment. So I'm assuming it's a MEMA issue if, in fact, all of us in eastern Massachusetts are now, or just say the 3 towns here are drowning, okay? And so you've got around, I'm assuming it's your responsibility then to come in with the additional whatever.
Right.
And all we do, we have to call you? We have to call you and say, help.
We have a system in place. Once the communities have tapped out of their normal resources, their community resources, their mutual aid resources, they look to us to start to bring in some of those extra resources, either from the state level. We also have agreements called EMAC, it's the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. That's between all 50 states and our territories. It's where we can send assets between states through agreements. So we'll start to bring in usually closer states if they're not impacted, so the New Hampshires, the Connecticut's, Rhode Islands. If it happens to be a whole East Coast type of issue, we can start bringing stuff from central, the Western Coast. We also have an IEMAC, which is our international emergency management assistance.
Get help from Canada.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually the easternmost provinces of Canada are able to send resources back and forth. So, and if we start tapping out all of those resources, we can then push it up to the federal government, and we'll start getting FEMA assets and FEMA resources in.
All right, so let's go back to humble little Holliston. And so we're in a flooding situation, and actually with the kind of rain that we've been getting lately, it's not impossible that something like this would happen this year, because even our little ponds and stuff have all started filling up, so that groundwater is just pushing right up to the top. So what do we as homeowners, residents, or whatever, what do we look for? What can we expect? If my basement starts to flood, can I get a sump pump from the department? Or will you come and pump out my basement? Because I remember when I first moved here, they would do that.
Sure. So we have a limited number of trash pumps that are available,
Okay.
and
They're
those
available for us to use?
from the fire department to loan them. Yes.
Okay.
Those often get loaned out very quickly
Right.
and very early, at which point we're out.
Okay, you're out.
We don't really do a lot of pumping of basements, both for a staffing and resource availability issue, but also for a liability reason.
Okay.
It's something that several years ago, the department had been pumping someone's basement, and someone's casement window in their basement was broken as the hose had been stuffed out of that window, and that person sent a basically invoice to the town hall saying you need to repair
Replace
the
my
damage
window.
that was caused by your people, at which point town hall was less receptive to us doing pumping of basements because they felt.
Thank you, whoever you are.
So we have local resources.
Okay.
Then beyond that, we can tap into regional resources, and there's a cache of equipment that's, for us, is very proximate. It's actually in Framingham at their, right across from Odessa.
Okay.
Their
DPW,
Yes.
I believe.
Okay,
So those are NERAC resources that we are a signatory to, and we have the ability
That's really close.
to request those. And those have not only things like pumps, but to talk about some of the resources that Mike mentioned from Merrimack Valley, things like light towers, things like variable message signboards. Because when you have a situation like Merrimack Valley and you're setting up a staging area where you need apparatus to go to, and when you're closing down multiple exits off of the highway, where do you quickly find message boards? MassDOT can get them, but it may be a little while. So there are regional resources that we have available to us. And then once we've exhausted the available resources, either locally or regionally, that's where we can turn to the state. And I would reach out to Mike at the Region 1 office and say, we're buried down here, this is what we've got going on. And then Mike would say, what do you need for resources? And again, MEMA is not a response agency, they're more of a coordination agency.
Yeah.
So they know where to find extra pumps.
Okay.
So if Berkshire County is not impacted by the coastal storm,
Yeah.
there may be stuff that can get moved from the western part of the state to the eastern part of the state, because odds are, if we're up to our waist in water, there are probably several other communities in Middlesex and Essex that are also buried in water.
right, but the issue then becomes the time. So the distance just to get the whatevers, the lights and the boats, the whatevers.
Sure.
Down here, you're adding another couple of hours to get, or more, because you've got to get people together and everything else like that. So in fact, what if somebody has his own boat, his own light tower, whatever? Is it acceptable to have people offer this stuff? Is there a way for within the system?
Sure. So there's a way for us to be able to use volunteers, but you talked earlier about how do you make sure that if things are done one way in Lawrence and things are done a different way in Andover.
Yeah.
So all of the communities use the incident command system. All of them are trained in the National Incident Management System, and ICS is a component of that. And so there's a way that we do donation management. There's a way that we do volunteer management. And so things need to be vetted. You need to make sure that there are controls in place to make sure that somebody isn't going to say that they're loaning us their light tower, and then at the end of the disaster they don't send us an invoice for $250 an hour times 14 days because we thought they were donating it, but really what they were doing was it was being made available to us on an immediate basis. So you need to just find out.
How do you do that, though? In the moment?
If you don't have agreements with local contractors, sign ahead of time.
Do we have agreements
We
with
do have
local-
some agreements with some vendors, yes.
There's also what we have is a statewide mutual aid agreement that the majority of communities in the Commonwealth have signed on to. I think there's about 310 out of our 351 communities that have signed into this agreement where they can share those resources between communities. So if Ashland has light towers that they're not using, there's an easy mechanism to get those light towers into Holliston through that mutual aid agreement.
That sounds easier than the volunteer piece. So they called, in the article, they called those affiliated volunteers. So that's kind of like you haven't gone through screening or whatever. You haven't been part of the training. You're just sort of an ad hoc volunteer. People that pop up and want to do things. Who corrals that? I mean,
that would be the local officials that need to vet people and determine.
Who? Here.
it's going to be whoever the incident commander is or who they designate that responsibility to. Odds are, depending on what the situation is, it might be me as the emergency management director.
Okay, so you now are getting, in addition to all of the other calls that are coming in, you're getting calls saying, hi, I've got a light tower?
And we keep track of that, and we say, thanks, how can we get a hold of you if we need it? And then we continue to check with the people who are out in the field, who are rolling out resources and deploying them, and we find out, do you have an additional need? Okay, we've got one that's available from a local volunteer, or can we wait 45 minutes and get one from a nearby municipality, which we know is much smoother.
Yeah, right.
And when we get into some of those larger disasters too, we actually, one of our ESFs is volunteers and donations management. So we have agencies like, again, Red Cross, Salvation Army. I believe the group is called Mass Cares, that does a lot of that volunteer management and organization part for us. So it's kind of taken off of our plate, because as you can imagine, people start offering up any resource they can, and it's all great stuff. But you start getting 10, 20, 50 calls coming in offering stuff. It's hard to keep track of kind of who's making that and what's coming in. So this group can kind of get together and start handling some of that, as many of them do that on a day-to-day basis already. The Red Cross.
Certainly, yeah. I used to be the director for the Red Cross here in Metro West, and I don't even know, is there that kind of presence since they moved into Newton and Boston? I mean, there's just we used to have disaster teams, so we would train so that we knew exactly what we were supposed to do, and all that the local officials really had to do was turn our piece over to us and know that we could do it, because we knew what all of we didn't have incident command at that time, but what all of that was.
Sure.
But we don't have that anymore, I don't think.
But if you speak to people who've been through some of these larger or expanding incidents, they'll tell you that the volunteer and the donation management almost becomes its secondary emergency or incident of its own.
Absolutely.
And so this is where having someone else that can manage that at more of a regional or statewide level is very, very beneficial.
What was the thing that they tried? Lisa Jackson used to be the head of, or she was our representative.
That was for Region 4A, so that was the public health.
Yeah, that thing.
Yes.
Is that still in place?
That was the HERC, the Holliston Emergency
Response
Coalition
or something.
But that was a DPH Region 4A initiative.
Is that still in place?
There is still and again, this comes back to what Mike was talking about earlier, that there are multiple plans. So we've got plans for fire, we've got plans for EMS, we've got plans for forestry, for disaster, there are plans for law enforcement resources, and then there are plans for public health, absolutely.
Yeah, epidemics, pandemics, whatever you call them.
Sure.
And we have been exercising a lot of these plans that have been built up and refined over the last couple of years, and those are exercised on both a local as well as a regional, and there have been statewide exercises where they get people together at places like the DCU Center, where you have emergency managers and other non-governmental agencies together in the room, several hundred of them, and they're going through a scenario, and they are talking about, okay, this is the this is the information that you and your organization have just received. How is it that you are going to respond? What can you do? How long is it going to take for you to get your people to the station, get them in the pickup truck, get them to the staging point where they then can proceed on to that next location, and discuss these around the table, in both within your discipline as well as then sending runners to tables, other tables where there are other disciplines.
Tell me, as a homeowner, a senior homeowner, okay? So what do I need to do at home?
As you said in your introduction, you need to be prepared to be self-sufficient for 48 to 72 hours.
Okay, so I have to be self-sufficient, and that means I know. I have to have food, I have to have water, I have to have my medicines, I have to have all that stuff, okay, for 48 to 72 hours. And then what? And I can't call you. There's just no point in calling you, because you've already told me I got to be self-sufficient, right?
We'll still take your call.
All right, so if I get hurt, if I fall, because now it's dark and I couldn't find my candles, and
sure.
Okay, so I fall, I can call?
You can.
Okay,
Absolutely.
And you'll come? Someone will come.
I can't guarantee it will be me, but someone will come.
Okay, so
we will get you the appropriate resources.
So what are the kinds of things I can call for? I mean, I can call for a medical emergency, obviously, but I can't call for a sump pump. I'm not going to call to ask you to bring me bottled water.
You can call for a sump pump.
I can call for a sump pump.
And we can send someone, and we can do an evaluation And this is where the big picture for the community needs to come in, because a lot of the calls we take, and remember, I started as a dispatcher, as I said earlier, to the individual homeowner, they say, my house is flooding, my basement is flooding, and we go out there
And there's this much water.
less than an eighth of an inch that
Yeah.
our trash pump won't even pick up.
Yeah.
Whereas we've just come from another spot in town where the person literally had water up to their knees.
Yep.
And so we're able to do a triage and determine we can bring some resources over here and that would have a benefit, versus maybe we need to spend 20 minutes reassuring and calming this resident down and explaining to them that, yes, it's an inconvenience, and we hope that we get power back soon, and then your own sump pump will be able to work again. And that's the other thing. During these dry weather days, if you know that you flood on a regular basis, you should be investing in a French drain, in a sump pump, in a battery backup for your sump pump. You should have a backup sump pump that's the exact same make, model, and fittings, so that when your sump pump burns up in the middle of the rainstorm, you or your neighbor, if they're a little bit more handy, can take that spare off of the shelf, uncouple the old one that has seized, and place the new one in service and immediately start pumping again. Oftentimes we go to folks and we go to the same house storm after storm after storm because we are their plan. They haven't planned for themselves.
I think one of the things you can do for homeowners too is, even ahead of this storm hitting, is look at what's in your basement. What do you have in there? Is it valuable stuff? Is it, we know the basements are usually the first thing that floods. So if you have your valuables sitting on the floor in the basement, you might want to think of a different spot to put them, or up on a shelf. Same with your utilities. A lot of people have their utilities in their basements, which I know is a little bit harder of a lift to move them. But if it's something that you're able to do, is get them above ground, get them out of that flood water, save some of your utilities and your valuables from your basement, and try to find a better spot to put them, knowing that flood water is going to get in.
Would I be right in saying that a lot of the calls you take are really more about the reassuring than anything else?
Yes, most definitely. And we are very good at coming alongside of our residents. And again, this is the joy of working in a small town, is that we have that personal touch.
Yeah.
And it may be someone that we've helped before, and they just know you helped us during that storm back in '05. Was wondering if you could bring another one of those pumps over. And we've set up generators, and we've set up pumps as we have them. We've got a limited supply. We don't have a finite amount of resources available to us as a local community, but we try to prioritize and do what we can to meet the need.
Okay, so back to the people and what they need to do. They need to obviously clear up the cellar, make sure that it's all as good as it can be, putting in sump pumps and all that kind of stuff, having the food, and hopefully being realistic about the fact that the 3 days it's going to feel like 10, and recognize that they may be uncomfortable with that idea.
And your personal plan needs to evaluate your situation. You've got family in the area. Part of your plan may be there may come
I'm going to their house.
there may come a time where I need to decide that it would be better and safer and more comfortable for me to go to a relative's. Some people have that option.
Yeah.
Others have family that are far, far away. But
Right.
do they have a friend from church or temple that they can go to? Do they have, a neighbor that they socialize with a lot? Do they know somebody else who might be on a different part of town that would be delighted to take them in? They just didn't think to offer.
Right.
And we saw that with our water crisis several years ago. There were people on the west side of town who were really not impacted by the situation, and they were able to let people from the east come and take a shower at their home. It seems like a small thing, but there are a lot
When you haven't had a shower for a few days, it really is a good thing.
Because although we opened up the middle school and made the showers available,
I remember that.
People just really aren't eager to go in a sterile environment like that, and they feel more comfortable going to a friend's house.
Yeah, I remember all the bottles of water and everything that we hauled around and all that kind of happy hoo-ha. Yeah, it was a pretty desperate time.
I'd say that 72-hour time frame too is really a planning time frame. I don't want to say that we're not going to have anything for you in 72 hours. It's really just plan for 72 hours in case we aren't able to, but hopefully by that time frame we're able to get some resources out to you, or some bottled water, or some some food or whatever it is, or some sort of shelter situation if that's what it comes to, set up by that time frame. So I just don't want to give the impression that 72 hours you're on your own for the whole time. It's just, but for planning purposes, it's at least good to have that amount of resources available to you, provided by yourself.
So how do we get people to do this?
We need to change their mindset. And so this is public education, but people think it won't happen here.
Yeah.
People think we live in a
Safe. Yeah, safe area.
and a reliable community. If you read social media, there's been a lot of pushback lately about all of the power outages that we've had in certain parts of town lately, and people are very shocked and dismayed that we've lost power so many times in the last year.
Yep.
Well, we've really become complacent, and we've taken certain things for granted in terms of what we're going to have available to us. I've been to Haiti, and as I spend time in Port-au-Prince, you're lucky if you get electricity for 5 hours in a 24-hour period, and you just learn to adapt.
And we used to. It's not like some of the younger people obviously have always been born into this, but there are generations, including mine, in which some things were not so predictable. It's like, yeah, we had electricity, folks, but, television wasn't 24 hours. Okay, you could only get it at 6 o'clock at night, that kind of thing. So anyway, I really do think that that's, for me anyway, the takeaway. And I have to admit that for myself, I'm not sure that I'm prepared for a 72-hour period myself. And you're supposed to have a go bag so that if all of a sudden you have to leave, and you're supposed to have extra medication in the go bag in case that's an issue for you, and all those kinds of things. I'd just like to, help in any way that I can with here or with Holliston Reporter or whatever, that, to get the word out. And maybe it's even something that you produce that goes home in tax bills and that kind of stuff. But that would make your life a whole lot easier too, if you could feel confident that people were as well cared for as possible.
And even things as basic as phone numbers, for your relatives, for your family, because when you had to evacuate quickly in a moment's notice, if your phone got left behind or your phone got flooded, all of your phone numbers
are in that cell phone.
For your family, for your doctor, for no one has a little phone book anymore.
Yeah.
People used to have like an index card next to their couch on the end table that had like the key phone numbers for people. People don't have that anymore. Everything is in our smartphone. And if that goes down, and it's going to be a couple weeks before you can go to the local whatever store, and they can download your information from the cloud to a new device. But for that time frame, how are you going to get a hold of your relatives? How are you? Nobody knows phone numbers anymore.
Yeah, well, it's true. I mean, unless I learned it before I got my smartphone.
It's like 911, right?
Well, that's the only number that they remember.
911, yeah, that's not good though.
No, it isn't.
It's not a good
but
thing.
that's the sort of thing that should go in your go bag. And just like you should have an updated quarterly list of medications, you also want to make sure you've got all of your updated phone numbers and contact information, bank information. Things so that you can access.
Yeah. Would you even remember? Yeah. Do you remember me? Standing in the bank saying, my account number, right?
Everyone remembers you, Mary.
No, but I mean, I can imagine myself walking in and say, does anybody remember who I am so you can get my account number, because it got washed away.
Yeah, you can imagine. I mean, the mobile phone issue is one of the big ones now, as everyone has their smartphones.
I hadn't thought about it.
Without power in your house or without somewhere to charge it, they only last 12 hours, 14 hours.
Depends on how many apps you have running.
Probably less than that for most people. But they do make those portable battery chargers now that is a good thing to throw in one of those bags, just that way you have at least another day or two of power for your phone.
Yep. I remember, we lost power on Roy Ave for 5 days. I lost everything in the freezer and the whole 9 yards because something had come down. This was just a few years ago. Tree took down whatever and kind of thing. And you could see people going out to their cars, turning on their cars and sitting there, waiting to charge their phones because it was the only way that they could. Yeah, okay. All right, well, that's a biggie. That's a real biggie. Okay. All right, well, I'm exhausted, so we have to stop. Michael, thank you very much for coming all the way from Stoneham. I know that was a horrible schlep, because that's just, I think 128 is a horrible schlep anyway, but in the rain, it's not good.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you for the work that you do. Not everybody wants that job. I know that. Thank you too, Michael, always. as always. All right, folks, we have a laundry list of things that we need to do, all of us. So we're going to get busy with that and get your go bag ready, get your 72 hours prepped, and we'll see you next time. I'll see if I can do something a little happier next time. This one was kind of a downer. Okay, great guys, though. Thank you very much. See you next time. Bye.